Hey everybody, good morning and welcome to another edition of Critical Methods video series. Today we're doing Jacques Derrida. This is really one of my favorite thinkers of all time, and really just sort of another moment like Foucault, like Saussure, in a series of these moments that we'll have this semester if everything is going well, if we're really reading and we're really paying attention, that have the possibility of really reorienting how we think about the entire world. Absolutely massive intervention from Jacques Derrida and in the history of philosophy, really. And part of what I want to start by, this will be an improvised video conversational, we'll sort of see how it goes. But I want to lay out a few of the main tenets of Derrida's approach, talk in specific about this really wonderful and difficult essay that we have in front of us today, Signature Event Context, which ends with Derrida's mimeographed signature, as though to authenticate this set of utterances that come to us mediated through writing in ways that, as Derrida wants to try to explain to us, means that it can never be finally authenticated. So his effort to show the kind of fundamental instability and proliferation of possibility in the linguistic encounter, in writing, as he calls it, is really a sort of love letter to the sort of possibilities encoded in literary art. So this is what makes Derrida's thinking so important to literary studies, is that it really shows that the literary text is essentially almost infinite. It doesn't mean you can say anything about it. It doesn't mean that there's no such thing as meaning. It doesn't mean that there's no stable truth. None of those sort of stereotypes that you see on the internet. What it does say is that the kind of fundamental structuring possibility of writing is that it can never be finally fixed. And for Derrida, that's not a sort of negative thing, that's a positive thing. And what he wants to do even more than that, and this is his overarching project that's really important for us to understand, is that he's offering a reading of the history of Western philosophy, the entire history of it, going back to Plato through the Enlightenment and Descartes and others. And as we see in this essay today, Condillac and J.L. Austin, thinkers you might not know about, but you should know that they're fundamental to a history and tradition of thinking that Derrida calls Western metaphysics. And what Derrida points out, and this is part of the bombshell, and you can see it all through the readings we've done so far, including Dracula, especially, as we'll talk about, is that the history of Western philosophy has been obsessed with immediacy, transparency, and fixing meanings to be final and secure. And Derrida, his insight into this, what he calls logocentrism, this putting the word and the idea of reason, logos, that's the Greek word for both word and reason, putting the word and reason at the very center of everything. In the beginning was the word. This logocentric history, Derrida will later in his career call phallogocentrism, to give us that sense, as he will constantly show us, that this effort to fix instability, to reduce unclarity, and to make murky things transparent and immediate to us is an effort towards mastery and domination that is part of a tradition of thinking that is essentially obsessed with fixing things and containing them. But what Derrida shows by looking at the function of writing through Saussurean insights that we'll talk about, is that the nature of writing means that this illusion of mastery can only ever be a dream, that we're always grasping toward it, but that moment of arrival, the achievement that would give us the sense of total fixity over meaning, for example, is always deferred. It's always later. It always has to come later. There has to be a supplement, a note, you could say, added on to the end that tries to secure through the mechanism of this authenticating mark or series of authenticating marks, a whole host of what is in the end unverifiable writing, stuff that is there circulating. So that's the sort of overarching critique of mastery, the critique of the impulse towards mastery that Derrida really wants us to understand. So that's a sort of preamble. I'm going to put my timer on and try to do a quick, like 12 minutes or so, to go through a little bit of what we see in Derrida's project here. So what I want to start by, I think, is looking at where Derrida ends in his essay, which is the idea of the signature. And so I'm going to try to bring up for us this moment at the end of the famous ending of this long and I know difficult essay, which is, let me just make this share, which is Derrida's signature. And what he says about the signature: by definition, a written signature implies the actual or empirical non-presence of the signer. That means, in other words, the reason you need a signature on a check is that I'm not there with the check to give you the money. Why do I need a signature on a pay stub or a mortgage or whatever? It's to verify my presence at that time. But it requires and is predicated on the fact that I'm not there. So in other words, this singular mark that always says that I was there also tells us that I'm not there. So the very moment that is called upon, and for Derrida, this is a kind of emblem, and I'm starting here because it gives a kind of good emblem for the rest of what he wants to say about all writing. But signatures work by trying to fix presence. They tell us that Derrida was there. I'm here. But the only reason they work, the only reason you need them, the fundamental aspect of them is that you're actually gone. So this interplay between the desire for presence and the necessity of absence gives us this sort of fundamental wavering at the heart of all of these efforts to write, to inscribe or write or fix presence, to communicate, as he says in this essay that's really about the idea of communication. Now, communication presumes that I can hand you some meaning, like if I communicate correctly this or that point, it's like I'm giving it to you, that it creates transparency of content, as though writing or the mechanisms of passage or transmission can be made invisible. But as we see from Dracula, it's constantly making visible the mechanisms of this translation. There's no such thing as perfect communication. Communication can always go wrong. The idea of the signature is that on the one hand, it's singular. It's meant to write, I was here on this day. I sign that and guarantee it. And I often put a date next to it. This means that it fixes an immediacy and a singular instance of presence. But as Derrida points out in his reading of the signature on 328 and 329, there's a displacement there because the signature, in order to be recognizable, has to be iterable. It means that it has to be recognizable again and again and again. It has to be essentially interchangeable with something else. You have to recognize it as my signature, for example, or Derrida's signature. It's never entirely singular, but it is meant to call or evoke a singular instance. So that sort of tension between singularity and iterability meaning the ability to repeat, and this crucial interplay between presence and absence, where absence is inscribed into all communicative writing. It has to be, the reason you have writing is that because I'm not there to talk to you about it. So writing for Derrida is a kind of proxy or prophylactic. It sort of stands in, prophylactic's the wrong word. I mean proxy for presence. So it stands in for presence and is meant to be there in lieu of immediate speech. So writing and speech are contrasted to one another, where speech is meant to be immediate and writing is a kind of mediate form, a translation if you want. And so that immediacy or unfixability of the final form of writing is really crucial to how Derrida sees written language as transpiring. Now, how does that work? mean, of course, you can recognize that we see this, for example, in Seward's phonograph, when the presence of his voice is transcribed into a set of documents that are in writing that then have to be translated and translated again. And then crucially, in a moment, I hope we can talk about at the end of Dracula, it's an immaculate postscript at the end that tries to sort of secure the whole thing. Remember, the last word of Dracula is Harker's signature, attempting to seal the deal. But what does that postscript tell us? There was hardly a single authentic document in the whole stack. Everything is a copy of a copy of a copy. So this desire to fix it as believable and true, and that's what the end of Dracula says, is for Derrida a symptom of this typical Western, and he says even male desire to have fixity and closure and guarantee the transmissibility of information in perfect form. But you can never do that because you and I both know that we are in the realm of the Saussurean sign. And as you remember from Saussure, I'm going to stop sharing now so I can talk with you directly through the channels of electronic communication, so it's not really direct. But I'm going to talk to you now about this. So you remember from Saussure that all signification happens by negation. The reason hat means hat and not cat is that it's in a chain of signs that work by negation. This one is not that one. This one is not that one. So it's only, there are no, it's difference without positive terms. You remember that from Saussure? Well, Derrida will take that and really run with it, because what he'll say to us is that all of signification is working by negation and difference and deferral, because that closed set that would give us the total language that would let us know why cat and hat are different is never finally finished. It always has the possibility of being added to it. What does that mean? I'm going to show you an example that I just thought of this morning that's really quite disturbing, but I kind of, for whatever reason, because I'm very tired, I thought it was funny. This says, I love my. You know what that means. This sounds like something that you say, I love, and that is a positive, affective, nice thing to say. And Derrida will say, but it's not, it could always continue. I love my, okay. Then what if you had, as in poetry, this is why poetry is such a crucial instance for Derrida, this set of ideas is always subject to being added to. Our chain of differential marks can be infinitely extended. So what if I said, I love my baby eating habit? The brackets around our set of terms is always subject to being extended, so that, and what did that do? That really like changed the entire valence of this statement. What Derrida wants us to see is that this subjective subjection to change and this deferral of final meaning is always a structural condition of all writing. You don't have writing unless it can be added to, supplemented, and essentially altered by a renewal of context. So this importance of context to fixing the meaning in this, because we can think of how we might change this again. And Derrida talks about citationality. Is that now we have yet another set of meanings, which now flips the affective valence once again, because now it's judging negatively this thing that we first thought was ascribed to me and it was positive. Then it became negative again, and now it's negative yet again because I've ascribed it to someone else. And you can continue adding additional context, further supplementary frames that would enable this initial unit of meaning to be changed yet again. And so what this means for Derrida is not just that meaning can be added on, or that you can keep framing and reframing and multiplying citations in order to change the meaning of something. But what he says, that's true. But what he says is that that's a structural condition of all writing. If it didn't have that capacity, it wouldn't be writing. You wouldn't need writing. But the reason that writing works is that I don't have to be there to guarantee its meaning. In fact, I can't be there. I write it, say I write a novel, and then I put it in print, and that means by its being in print that I, the supposed guarantor of its final and fixed meaning, the fixer of its context, is gone, is absent. So now Dracula, this text, can function in all sorts of ways that could never be fixed or anticipated or let alone controlled by that initial author or sender of the message. In this case, let's say Bram Stoker. But or you could take a character in the text who's writing something, but then it gets translated and moved and recontextualized into a sheaf of papers by Mina. Does it mean exactly what it meant when it first was written or uttered? Who knows? It might not. And this ambiguity, or the deferral of fixity, let's call it, is a structural condition of all writing. And so there's really a ton to say about this, but I want us to see that this combination of meaning by negation and that fixity, the supposed fixity of context that in fact can always be recontextualized, is part of what Derrida wants us to see as, again, this sort of structural condition of all writing. And that structural condition is a bombshell at the heart of the entire project, he says, of Western metaphysics. He calls it elsewhere a white mythology, because we want to fix meaning and master and be in control, finally, of meaning and all of its other relevant categories, of all the binaristic differences that Western reason is predicated on: male, female, dark, light, sun, moon. You can imagine many more that we ourselves built when we built those grids. These binaristic oppositions that we try so hard to make stick. The West is the best. The East is the worst. Masculine heroism is the best. We're obsessed with that, we think. But who's the secret hero of the whole book? Who's in charge of it? It's Mina. The effort to fix and to determine mastery and to stabilize these categories always produces its own undoing. This is the important idea that's at the heart of what Derrida sometimes calls deconstruction. In the letter to the Japanese friend that you read, he explains that that term itself is a kind of, if you want that thing to mean something finally and to give a kind of like dictionary definition of it, you've sort of missed the boat, because then what you're wanting is direct presence. What you're demanding is a kind of clarity and frictionless communicative instance. And he says the whole point of deconstruction is to show that that's impossible, that these equational processes, these equational logics, where S equals P, as he says, subject is predicate, those substantive declarations of essential correspondence do not work. They are fantasies rather than actual possibilities. And why is that? The secret to understanding it lies in the nature of writing. He talks about performative utterances, for example, and he's reading J.L. Austin. This will be the last thing I say. He talks about performative utterances, which are like when you say, when the words do the thing they say. So performative utterances like, I marry you, or you are knighted. The saying of the word does the thing. And so Austin, in his famous explanation of these strange linguistic events that seem to rely on singularity of instance and they produce actual effects in the world, Austin says, well, yeah, it's true that if you said it on stage, or if I said it right now in a video, you're not like married after I do that. I say, you're married now. That's not a real performative. That's because the context is not appropriate, and that these utterances that do the thing I, Austin, say they do, rely on specific contexts. And everybody knows that. So we're not even going to think about other contexts. Like when you say, remember that time when the guy said, I got married? Well, that's a citational instance. Or when you say it ironically, like as if I got married. All these innumerable instances in which the performative utterance doesn't actually do the thing it does. Austin wants to discount them because he's subscribing to this metaphysics of presence. He said, don't worry about that. Those are weird. Those are strange anomalies that we're not concerned with. And Derrida says at the end of his essay, which you should look at again, he says, the things that Austin wants to deny and push to the side are the structuring condition of all writing. In other words, the things that produce ambiguity and anomaly and are structurally possible for all acts of writing. So you can't push it to the side or ignore it because that's constitutive of what writing is. All speech acts essentially include the possibility of their citationality. They can be used elsewhere in other contexts for different purposes, ironically, for example, and that's not some anomaly or weird thing you can just get rid of. That's how all language works. It's fundamentally unstable in that sense. Is that a negative thing for Derrida? No, it's a positive thing. It means that that fundamental play at the center of all efforts to make meaning, that wobble at the heart of all communication, proliferates possibility all the time. So against mastery, against fixity, against the desire, obsessive desire by the Jonathan Harkers of the world to fix an ambiguous stack of paperwork into final meaning, against that desire for mastery, Derrida celebrates play. I'm going to leave you with that. We're going to talk in class. We're going to show up in groups. I hope you watch this video at triple speed. Thank you guys for your patience. There's tons more to say about this, as I'm sure you can guess. But I hope this gives us at least a foothold to get into some close reading of this challenging and really mind-blowing essay. Thanks a lot. I'll see you guys tomorrow morning or afternoon, depending on your section.